Okay. And we are live on YouTube, folks, with the Chi-Town Expat coming up here. And Ron, we are going to get started. So I'm going to stand by and I'll cue you in. When I point to you, that's you go talking. This is cued that you're almost ready to talk, and then you're live, okay? Can you give me a mic check real quick?
1, 2, 3.
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you. You are on 2. And
Hey, it's the Chi-Town Expat. Ron Harders as your host, and we're back. And a couple of things that might be of interest to you. On May 5th, there's going to be a grassroots Republican gathering at El Prado Park on 19th Avenue and between, where is that, about Rosa and, no, between Broadway and, no, it's not, it's farther south. It's between Southern and Baseline. And it's from 11 to 2. And there'll be food and a bouncy house for the kids and all kinds of fun. And we can meet some politicians, but they won't be able to talk except to you personally. Anyway, so you're invited. And actually, we're there to recruit PCs and to get people to become active grassroots Republicans. So that's one thing. The next thing is, I want you to understand that most Americans never stop to think what other humans suffer under communist regimes. And if you listen to politicians and the media, you would think the Chinese are our best friends. They aren't. They are our enemies and always will be. Why? Because of communism, and make no mistake, Xi's regime is communist. And every communist regime that's ever existed in the world has been to the detriment of the common people, to the grassroots. And the only ones that get wealthy and get well out of it are the elites that run them. So now our intelligence officials fear that China's global campaign of kidnapping citizens that they want to repatriate for one reason or another has reached our borders. I would wager a guess that it happened long ago. We just haven't been paying attention, which is probably a problem that we have in this country anyway, almost all the time. These people are brought back to China, where they may face arrest and imprisonment on political and corruption charges. Beijing admits that Chinese officials are doing this. They aren't trying to hide it. They have repatriated more than 3,000 people who had escaped overseas since late 2012. Xinhua reports what they call repatriation is often coercion or kidnapping. They threaten these people and their families. It's the communist way. In one example cited in an excellent report by Foreign Policy, a Chinese-Canadian billionaire named Zhao was snatched from his hotel in Hong Kong in 2017 and was loaded, after probably being sedated, into a wheelchair and rolled out through the lobby with a sheet covering his head. Similar stories have also come out of Australia. A U.S. intelligence partner, including one about a man who was allegedly drugged by Chinese security forces and transported back to the mainland on a state-owned shipping vessel. An initial police report filed by a family member was quickly withdrawn, and Zhao later issued a statement denying that he had been kidnapped. More than 1 year later, he remains in mainland China. And though he hasn't been charged with any crime, his businesses under government direction are expected to sell almost $24 billion in investments, which will reportedly be used to repay state banks. Chinese nationals who are here in the U.S. legally have also started to disappear under suspicious circumstances. The only difference here is that these individuals are not high-profile targets. They're just normal people. There were multiple reports of people observing Chinese intelligence operatives materializing around the schools or residences of the missing people, one intelligence official said. One theory was that they were strong-arming them in person, saying, "We're here. Your flight back to China is..." Just a second. "Tomorrow." The official stressed that there still is a difference between kicking in a door and taking a guy forcefully away and saying, "Come with us or we'll kill your family," in Inner Mongolia, still in one case involving a Chinese graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley. There was evidence of this person being taken against their will, and no one notices or says a word. The kidnappings happen all over the world and follow the same pattern. Either the person is threatened and goes with Chinese intelligence agents, or they are forcibly kidnapped. When they are in China, they disavow being kidnapped, and their assets usually are seized by the Chinese government. Some of these Chinese nationals are, in fact, nationals of other countries. Powerful businessmen, ex-Chinese Communist Party officials, dissidents, and activists have all been targeted as part of what Western intelligence officials say appears to be a large-scale campaign. These cases of forced repatriation appear to show just how seriously the Communist Party takes its assertion that anyone it regards as a national, no matter where they live, work, or study, is subject to its authority. The kidnappings have begun to occur in the territory of core U.S. allies, including some of the Five Eyes intelligence partners: the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. The Chinese have become emboldened, like the Russians, believing no one will do anything of substance to stop them. It appears that the forced repatriations started in earnest in 2004. In 2014, Beijing formally announced that it was expanding its anti-corruption campaign, known as Skynet on Foxhunt, to target officials living abroad. In mainland China, the use of kidnapping and illegal detention has become such a standard part of the Communist Party's disciplinary procedures that it even has a name, Shuanghui, in order to isolate suspects in corruption cases, which are often intertwined with fights among party factions. Security officials seize them, hold them in undisclosed locations, and torture them to extract quick confessions. The use of Shuanghui has increased sharply since President Xi Jinping launched his anti-corruption drive about 5 years ago. U.S. intelligence noticed that Chinese people began disappearing in the United States. The number of suspicious disappearances at the time was small, fewer than 6. One former senior intelligence official said, China has formal legal channels to retrieve economic fugitives, according to a former senior U.S. law enforcement official. Chinese officials about 3 years ago gave their American counterparts a list of U.S.-based individuals they wanted deported to China. The list, which numbered nearly 200 people and included 15 to 20 individuals in the Los Angeles area alone, tended to trump up charges in many cases, says the law enforcement official. China and the United States do not have an extradition treaty, but in 2015, the Department of Homeland Security agreed to enhance cooperation with China on deportation of U.S.-based fugitives. The CIA and the State Department referred questions about alleged cases of forced repatriation to the Justice Department. The DOJ released a brief statement on the matter. The U.S. Department of Justice will not allow the United States to become a safe haven for criminals. The spokesman wrote in an email to Foreign Policy. The department will assist other countries if evidence of criminality is presented, but will not accept unilateral law enforcement activity by another country on our territory. And that, when given the corruption at the DOJ and the FBI and so on, you wonder who's cooperating with who. The Chinese government alternates between vague threats and appeals to consider family, the phrasing they use, either to force you back or to get you to give information when you're back. It would be best for your father if you did this, or don't you want the best thing for your father? The person says, often the Chinese government operatives will also try to appeal to the person's patriotism. They'll say, you're Chinese. Don't you want to help the motherland? And when they want to intimidate or bully you, they say, you're too American. You don't understand how things work in China. If that doesn't do the trick, they get rougher. With most people, threats and imprisonment were enough. person says, but with the really hard men, they tortured or threatened to torture the wives and relatives. China is flexing its muscle across the planet militarily and economically, and they also feel it is their right to go after Chinese nationals, no matter what country they are in or whether they are a citizen or not. Their intelligence agents are little better than the Gestapo was, and they are feared just as much. Under Xi, it has gotten much worse, and he's just begun to use his power as the new Chinese dictator for life. And that's just one of the things that the communists are doing, especially the Chinese, to keep control of their dissidents and escapees. So today, we really need to be aware of what's going on with these people and be able to help them in some way and make sure that our corrupt Congress doesn't go along with the communist regime desires. Now, we've heard a lot about the opioid crisis. And there's some myths and lies. And it's time to build the wall. Over 63,600 Americans died after overdosing on drugs in 2016. According to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, of these, 42,249 people died from taking opioids, which is a deceptive catch-all word that includes both prescription painkillers such as oxycodone and hydrocodone, as well as illicit drugs such as heroin and synthetic fentanyl. For some reason, the 21,351 people who died after overdosing on non-opioids like cocaine and methamphetamine are not in the conversation. Isn't that interesting? Of the 42,249 people who died from taking opioids, how many were from doctor prescriptions? How many were from people doctor shopping or otherwise using their own prescriptions? How many deaths were from drugs illegally pushed through the southern border? Without the answers to these questions, how can Americans possibly know that the billions of dollars allocated to combat the opioid epidemic will be spent wisely? Now, my comment on that is, whenever the government spends money, it's never wisely or correctly. Daniel Horowitz has been trying to get to the bottom of it. I asked CDC the 800-pound gorilla question on their latest overdose report. How much was illicit and how much prescription? They said we cannot separate out prescription opioids from heroin in this current analysis because we sought to include all opioids regardless of type. That was by David Horowitz at the RM Conservative on March 14th, 2018. Since the opioid crisis really started getting legs in the mainstream media, there's been an uncomfortable sense that there is an agenda hiding in there somewhere. What is the point of lamenting about an opioid crisis if exploring the source of the drugs being abused is not a part of the conversation? So show me the money. The left has been screaming for more taxpayer funding to combat the opioid epidemic, and to be fair, so have many on the right. Taxpayers are spending $4.6 billion as allocated in the latest omnibus bill. This on top of $144.1 million doled out by the Department of Health and Human Services in September 2017, and on top of $485 million in grants dished out in April 2017. Politico reported in November 2017 that a group calling itself the Opioid Network, spearheaded by the Center for Popular Democracy, whose board happens to be full of flaming radical Marxists like Francis Fox Piven and Brian Kettering, was demanding $45 billion for the opioid epidemic. Discrediting doctors and ignoring the poorest border. While the leftist radicals scream for more taxpayer money and are often accommodated by the swamp to fund their newly established opioid treatment centers, the actual core problem is being ignored. The poorest border. Are the fatal overdoses due to greedy doctors overprescribing pain medication, along with their complicit friends in the pharmaceutical industry? Of course not. One of the very best journalists covering the opioid crisis is Daniel Horowitz of Conservative Review. In an article he wrote earlier this month, he explains how illicitly obtained drugs should be the focus. The epidemic we are facing today is not from prescription opioids, at least not more than it has been for an entire generation. The number of prescriptions has already been reduced dramatically, and the overdose rate has leveled off and even dropped in some of the most affected states since 2016, like Ohio. Almost the entirety of the increased fatalities above the long-term existing trajectory beginning in 2012 were from illicit drugs, and mainly from the most dangerous one, heroin. Then as heroin use began to skyrocket in 2013 to 2014, we began to see the growth of the cursed synthetic drug fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine and can kill in small quantities. The reason this author opines that the statistics for the opioid crisis lump in prescribed and illicit fatal overdoses is because they want to downplay the fact that many of these drugs are coming in the country via the Mexican drug cartels. China, for example, works with the Mexican drug cartels to bring Americans fentanyl, which is often cut into heroin. As reported as Vice News The powerful synthetic opioid fentanyl is now the deadliest drug in America, causing an estimated 19,000 fatal overdoses in 2016. The DEA says most of the illicit fentanyl comes from China, either shipped directly to U.S. consumers through the mail or mixed with heroin that is smuggled across the southern border by Mexican drug cartels. The southwest border of the United States is porous. James Hunt, special agent in charge of the DEA's New York Field Division, said, "There's thousands of miles of border, thousands of trucks stop every day at the border. There's millions and millions of parcels coming into the country every day, and you can't search them all, and traffickers know that." From CNN in February 2016. Although the abuse of prescription opioids has been decreasing in recent years, they are still rampant. In addition, the rate of opioid drug overdose death, unlike benzodiazepine deaths, has continued to increase since 2010. In addition, there has been an uptick in deaths related to illegal opioids, such as heroin and fentanyl. As reported by at the Cato Institute, for nearly a decade, policymakers have brought into the misguided narrative that the opioid overdose crisis is a result of careless doctors and greedy pharmaceutical companies getting patients hooked on prescription opioids and condemning them to the nightmarish world of drug addiction. As a result, the Drug Enforcement Administration has ordered decreases in prescription opioid production. This focus on the supply and prescription of opioids makes many patients needlessly suffer in pain. Some, in desperation, turn to the illicit market to get relief, where they find heroin and heroin-laced fentanyl often cheaper and easier to get. Some resort to suicide. Policymakers mistakenly focus on doctors treating their patients in pain. By intruding on the patient-doctor relationship, they impede physician judgment and increase patient suffering. But another unintended consequence is that by reducing the amount of prescription opioids that can be diverted to the illicit market, they have driven non-medical users to heroin and fentanyl, which are cheaper and easier to obtain on the street than prescription opioids and much more dangerous. According to the Center for Disease Control website, 40% of all opioid overdose deaths involve a prescription opioid. The source of the 40% is this study, which does not appear to say a word about overdose deaths related to prescription drugs. We have a call into the CDC to get the source, and we'll update the article accordingly. The National Safety Council promotes the narrative that doctors are to blame. The National Safety Council is launching an exhibit at the White House that furthers the doctors are the problem narrative. The exhibit is named Prescribed to Death, a memorial to the victims of the National Safety Council. A memorial to the victims of the opioid crisis and features 22,000 faces carved into pills who represent those, according to the National Safety Council, who die each year from prescription opioid overdoses. TrevorLoudon.com contacted the National Safety Council for the source of the 22,000 figure, and were told it was 2015 CDC data. After contacting them a second time for a report or study that can be referenced, this link was provided, but it continues to be unclear where the figure 22,000 fatal overdoses related to prescriptions can be found. Honored that our exhibit Prescribed to Death, a memorial to the victims of the opioid crisis, will be on the ellipse at White House between April 12th and 18th, made possible in partnership with National Park Service and Interior. Stay tuned on our social channels. Hashtag Stop Everyday Killers. Pick. Twitter.com KV1CAFJKOY. The NSC. I'm very pleased to welcome the Opioid Memorial to the President's Park on April 1st. I encourage all to visit and remember those who we have lost to this deadly epidemic. We will keep fighting until we defeat the opioid crisis. How did the opioid crisis begin? The early to mid-90s, the federal government pressured doctors to prescribe more pain medication. The Clarion Ledger had a very revealing statement on this back in January 2018. The FDA played a key role in the greatest medical disaster in U.S. history, the opioid epidemic that has fueled so many drug overdose deaths. They now top all the nation's deaths in world wars. Until the 1990s, doctors had generally avoided prescribing opioids for chronic, long-term, non-cancer pain, such as lower back pain, because of concerns about addiction. In 1995, Dr. Curtis Wright, the team medical review officer for the FDA, recommended approval of Purdue Pharma's OxyContin for moderate to severe pain. But even before 1995, the federal government felt compelled to pressure doctors to prescribe pain medication to patients, even shaming them by referring to their concerns about addiction as a myth. Consider an excerpt from this article published at the New York Times in 1992. U.S. urges doctors to fight surgical pain and myths. The government recommended today that doctors provide painkillers swiftly and aggressively to patients after surgery to decrease suffering and speed recovery. Federal health officials said myths about pain and its management cause half of the patients who undergo surgery and more than 23 million procedures each year to suffer unrelieved, unnecessary pain. We can do more and we can do better to control pain after surgery, the New York Times said. The government recommended today that doctors provide painkillers swiftly and aggressively to patients after surgery to decrease suffering and speed recovery. Federal health officials said myths about pain and its management cause half of the patients who undergo surgery and more than 23 million procedures each year to suffer unrelieved, unnecessary pain. We can do more and we can do better to control pain. After surgery, the Health and Human Services Secretary, Dr. Lewis W. Sullivan, said at a news conference, "This guideline discusses the actual physical damage which a patient can sometimes suffer as a result of pain, and it shows that inadequately managed pain can inhibit recovery, prolong hospitalization, and thus potentially contribute to higher than necessary costs. When doctors simply call for injections of such painkillers as morphine and codeine as needed, the results are often under medication and unnecessary pain in roughly half the patients," said Dr. James O. Mason, head of the Public Health Service, of which the new agency is a component. As an aside to that, my mother was in a nursing home in 2003, and she was on her deathbed. And they had given her a shot of morphine to alleviate her contractions that she was having. And she continued to have the contractions. And I said to the nurse, "Why don't you give her another shot?" "Oh no, we can't do that. She might become addicted." I want you to know she was on her deathbed. She died within an hour of the time that they wouldn't give her a second shot to alleviate her pain. So there's a whole bunch of things that go along with pain and so on, but once the government got involved, everything else got screwed up. And somewhere along the line, there's got to be people in the government who are profiting from the illegal drugs coming across the border, which is one of the reasons why they don't want the border closed and why we are suffering as a people. And we're letting the Democrats get away with their BS about open borders and all the rest of the things that they tell us. So, folks, I want you to understand that it's time that we deplorables, the grassroots Republicans and disaffected Republicans who are now independents, and disaffected Democrats who are now independents, stand up and help the Donald clear up the swamp. We've sat back and done nothing for too long. We've been too busy chasing our dreams and our desires with not a thought being given to what we could do to save our country. And it's time now. Time to get off the couch. Time to get active. Time to join the grassroots Republicans. And let's change the country back to its roots. Let's make America great again. Make it the shining light on the hill. And just be proud to be Americans. After all, we fought a war in 1860 in which 700,000 white people died to free the Africans that had come here as slaves. And the Democrat Party has endeavored to keep them as slaves forever. And now the new plantation is the city, is cities like Detroit and Chicago and Baltimore and so on. And we keep electing these people back into office because they keep breaking us up into groups that we really are not part of. So let's give up this collective mentality. Let's give up this progressive mentality, and which truly is regressive. And let's become free-thinking, freewheeling Americans again. But let's keep it interesting. Let's keep ourselves interested and active. And let's not let any of these politicians fool us again. So until the next time, have a good week. How's that?
Excellent. Very good. Catch them next week, folks. Saturdays at 3 p.m. live. We'll be live streaming on CenterRight.live at 3 p.m. today. Have a good